I never expected my story to begin under fluorescent lights, surrounded by sterile walls, and the sharp smell of disinfectant that clung to the air like a reminder that nothing intimate could survive here. I had injured my knee weeks before, and the dull ache had grown into something that demanded attention. Sitting on the padded table, I felt exposed in a way I couldn't quite name. My leg extended awkwardly, the paper beneath me crickling with every small shift of weight. My heart was restless, though there was no reason for it to be, at least not yet. The door opened quietly, and the sound of her footsteps carried across the room with a steady rhythm. I lifted my eyes, expecting another routine appointment, a checklist of movements and reminders to rest. Instead, the moment she entered, something in the air thickened. She carried herself with calm precision, a confidence that filled the space before she even spoke, though no words were necessary for me to feel it. I noticed the way her gaze moved, deliberate and assessing, pausing just slightly too long as it swept over me. That pause made my chest tighten, though I forced myself to look away. When she began her examination, her hands were professional, but my body betrayed me. The first touch was meant to measure, to test the stiffness of the joint, yet it rippled through me with unexpected intensity. Her fingers pressed gently, tracing the line of my muscles, and the sensation burned longer than it should have. I tried to remind myself that this was medical, neutral, necessary, but even the pressure of her palms against my skin felt personal. The rhythm of her movements was careful, but there was warmth beneath the surface, an energy that seemed to seep into me and linger. I found myself aware of everything: her scent, faint but distinct, the subtle sound of her breath as she leaned closer, the cool fabric of her sleeve brushing against my bare thigh. These details invaded my senses, becoming sharper with each passing moment. I was no longer thinking about my knee, about recovery, or even about my body's limitations. Instead, I was caught in the tension between familiarity and strangeness, between what was supposed to happen and what was actually unfolding. The boundaries of the room seemed to shrink, leaving only her presence and the weight of her touch. Lying back as she adjusted the angle of my leg, I stared at the ceiling, trying to will my heartbeat into steadiness. But the more I resisted, the more aware I became of her. My pulse throbbed not in my knee, but everywhere else, alive with a restless current. Every adjustment she made seemed to draw me closer to an edge I hadn't realized was near. Her fingertips pressed firmly into the muscles above my knee, steady and unyielding, and it was as though she was reaching past flesh into something deeper, something I had never allowed anyone to touch. The silence between us grew heavy, more telling than any conversation could have been. It was the kind of silence that hummed with things unsaid, with questions neither of us dared to form. I felt my breath shorten, shallow and uneven, as if the air itself was charged. Her movements slowed, just slightly, but enough for me to notice, and that small delay carved itself into me like a secret. My skin prickled, my stomach tightened, and I realized that I was no longer simply a patient. I had become something else in that room, though I didn't yet know what name to give it. I told myself it was exhaustion or nerves or the vulnerability of being handled in such a direct way. Yet deep inside, I knew those explanations were lies I invented to protect myself from admitting the truth. There was an intimacy in her hands, in the steadiness of her touch, that felt both wrong and irresistible. Each second carried me further into a space I had not chosen but could not escape. The boundaries of professionalism, of purpose, blurred so easily in my mind that I no longer cared to separate them. When she finally stepped back, letting go of my leg, I felt the absence like a loss. The warmth of her hands remained ghosted on my skin, and my body ached not from injury, but from the withdrawal of her presence. I sat there, frozen, afraid that if I moved too quickly, she would sense the storm unraveling inside me. My fingers dug into the paper-covered cushion beneath me, and I steadied myself with the reminder that this was just therapy, just treatment. But even as I whispered that truth silently, I knew that nothing about this felt simple anymore. The session ended with the same calm precision it had begun, yet nothing inside me was calm. I left the room with my knee supported, but it was not my injury that consumed me. It was the lingering awareness of her touch, the way the air had shifted when she entered, the silent charge that had wrapped itself around me. I stepped into the hallway carrying more than my own weight. I carried the unspoken beginning of something that I could neither deny nor explain, something that had already claimed me before I had the chance to resist. I returned to her office the next week with the same mixture of dread and anticipation, though I pretended it was only about my knee. The ache had dulled, the stiffness easing, but I carried with me a tension that had nothing to do with muscles or ligaments. The sterile room looked unchanged, the same white walls, the same humming lights, the same padded table waiting for me. Yet it all felt charged now, like a stage where something invisible had already been rehearsed. I climbed onto the table, the paper crinkling under my weight, and tried to steady my breathing. My body was restless before she even walked in. When she entered, her presence filled the room as before, though I told myself not to notice. I tried to focus on the routine of the appointment, on the way she set down her clipboard and washed her hands, on the clinical rhythm of it all. But my eyes betrayed me. They followed the curve of her shoulders, the smooth efficiency of her movements, the subtle sway of her hips beneath fabric that should have been neutral, but now felt like an invitation. I told myself I was imagining it, but the imagination was too vivid to ignore. My chest tightened, my pulse rising in time with the anticipation that built before she even touched me. Her hands returned to my leg with steady pressure, and I felt the familiar surge, that inner tremor I could no longer dismiss as chance. She guided me through stretches, bending and straightening my knee, reminding me to breathe. Her palms pressed firmly into my skin, and each contact left behind a warmth that spread like fire. I clenched my jaw, pretending it was strain from the exercise, but in truth it was restraint, the effort to stop myself from arching into her touch. The silence between us once again grew heavy, filled with all the things I couldn't name. The session was clinical in form, but my body read it differently. Every adjustment of my position became a brush of proximity, every instruction a wordless command that I obeyed without thought. When she steadied my thigh, her grip felt more deliberate than necessary. When her arm brushed against mine, the contact lingered, as if neither of us was willing to retreat too quickly. I began to wonder if she felt it too, if she noticed the way my breath caught or my skin flushed under her hands. My body betrayed me in ways I couldn't control, and I prayed she wouldn't notice, even as I secretly longed for her to. As the exercises continued, I realized I was no longer present in the way I should have been. I wasn't counting repetitions or focusing on the angle of my movements. Instead, I was absorbed in every small detail about her scent, the faint rhythm of her breathing, the way her fingertips pressed just enough to command, but not enough to hurt. I watched her lips as she leaned in close, not for their words, but for the way they moved, soft and deliberate. The thought of them against my skin flashed through me, unwanted but insistent, leaving me flushed with heat I could neither suppress nor explain. There were moments that unsettled me more than the touch itself. Once, when she adjusted my leg, her hand slid higher than it should have, pausing at the edge of a place too intimate for the guise of therapy. She did not flinch, and neither did I. My breath stuttered, but I held still, unwilling to break the moment. It could have been an accident, yet it lingered in my body for hours afterward, haunting me with questions I refused to ask. I told myself it was nothing, but my pulse quickened at the memory. memory, proof that it was something. When the session ended, she stepped back, leaving me alone on the table. The air felt suddenly empty, hollow without her presence near me. I sat there for a moment, gathering myself, trying to mask the chaos that churned inside. My body ached, not from the exercises, but from the absence of her hands. I slid off the table slowly, careful not to reveal the trembling in my legs, and told myself I was imagining everything. But deep inside, I knew the line between therapy and something else was already beginning to blur. Walking out into the hallway, I carry a strange heaviness with me. It was not fear, and it was not shame. It was something far more complicated, a mixture of desire and confusion that knotted itself into my chest. I felt caught between wanting to escape and needing to return, between denying what was happening and craving more of it. Each step away from that room made me feel further from myself. I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that I was not afraid of my injury anymore. What I feared now was the hunger that had taken root in me, a hunger I could no longer pretend did not exist. The next appointment felt different before it even began. I sat in the waiting room with my hands clasped too tightly in my lap, staring at the clock as though the steady movement of its hands might calm me. My knee no longer ached in the way it once had, yet I clung to the excuse of lifeline. When my name was called and I stepped into the familiar room, I felt an electric pulse in the air, as if the walls themselves carried memory. My skin was already tingling with expectation before she even laid a hand on me. I climbed onto the table, pretending to adjust my position, but in truth I was restless. The crinkling paper beneath me sounded louder than usual, like it was announcing my unease to the room. My breathing was shallow, but I tried to mask it, hoping she would not notice. Yet I knew she always noticed more than she let on. She entered, calm and composed, her eyes meeting mine briefly, and the world seemed to pause in that instant. Her hands found my leg again, the touch firm, steady, professional in every sense, but I had lost the ability to separate treatment from something else entirely. She began moving my knee through its range of motion, guiding it with smooth precision, but all I could feel was the heat of her skin through the thin layer of fabric. The brush of her fingertips against my thigh sent ripples across me that had nothing to do with therapy. Each adjustment felt less like correction and more like a silent exploration. When she asked me to lie back, I obeyed without hesitation, though my body trembled faintly. Staring up at the ceiling, I focused on the fluorescent light above, but it blurred in my vision as her hands pressed deeper into the muscles of my thigh. Her touch lingered longer this time, slipping higher, edging toward places that should have remained untouched. My stomach tightened, and I bit the inside of my lip, willing myself to remain still. Yet the stillness itself betrayed me, because I did not pull away. The rhythm of the session slowed, as though time itself had changed speed. Her hand pressed firmly near my hip, adjusting the alignment, but it lingered in a way that made my breath falter. The other hand steadied my ankle, keeping me balanced, while her presence leaned closer, her warmth pressing against me without ever fully touching. I felt surrounded, suspended in a moment where everything familiar became unrecognizable. My body responded instinctively, a tremor running through me, as though she had unlocked something hidden and waiting. For a fleeting second, I thought I felt her fingers graze the inside of my thigh more deliberately than before. It could have been necessary, a correction of form, but my mind rejected that logic instantly. My heart pounded in my chest, my pulse loud in my ears, as I tried to decipher whether it was intention or accident. The truth didn't matter, because the effect was the same. Heat spread through me in waves, my breath quickening, and I had to close my eyes to keep from unraveling. The silence was unbearable, weighted with things unsaid, filled with an energy that felt almost physical. I wanted to believe she didn't notice my reaction, but her movements told me otherwise. The way she steadied my leg with just enough pressure, the subtle drag of her fingertips as they withdrew, the careful way she repositioned me, it all hinted at awareness. It was as if we were speaking a language neither of us had been taught, a secret script written in touches and pauses. When she finally stepped back, I felt the sudden absence like a sharp chill. My skin still burned where her hands had been, my body thrumming with a need I couldn't admit. I sat up slowly, afraid the tremor in my limbs might give me away. The session had ended like all the others, with nothing outwardly unusual, but inside I was undone. I gathered my belongings with hands that felt clumsy, my throat tight as though I had swallowed something I couldn't release. Leaving the room, I felt caught between denial and surrender. Part of me wanted to erase the sensations, to convince myself that nothing had happened beyond routine therapy, but another part of me, stronger, louder, clung to every detail, replaying the way her touch had lingered, the way her presence had filled the space. The hallway outside seemed unbearably ordinary compared to the charged silence I had just left behind. My body still pulsed with awareness, carrying the memory of her hands like a secret I was powerless to forget. I walked away knowing something irreversible had shifted. I had allowed myself to stay still when I should have moved, to welcome what I should have refused. And though no words had been spoken, I felt marked, as if the invisible line we both pretended to guard had already been crossed. The truth settled in me quietly, dangerously. I no longer wanted healing. I wanted her. The night I stayed after hours felt like stepping into a dream I wasn't sure I had the right to enter. The clinic was quieter than usual, the corridors dim, the hum of the lights softer, as though the building itself conspired to hide what was about to happen. I had lingered intentionally, claiming I needed extra stretching, though in truth it was hunger that kept me there. My body buzzed with anticipation as I lay back on the table, the silence between us already more intimate than any touch. She moved around me with deliberate calm, her presence circling like gravity I could no longer resist. Her hands pressed against my thigh, steady and unhurried, but there was no mistaking the shift. The touch was no longer simply corrective. It lingered, slid higher, tested boundaries we both knew were ready to break. I tried to control my breathing, but every exhale gave me away, each shaky release of air betraying the storm inside. The warmth of her palms spread across my skin, seeping deeper than muscle, filling places I had kept locked away. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat, each beat pulling me further from restraint. When she leaned closer, her hair brushed against my shoulder, and I felt the heat of her body hovering above mine. I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to surrender, to let myself dissolve into the current that had been building for weeks. Her lips found the side of my neck, soft at first, barely grazing, but enough to send a tremor down my spine. I tilted my head back instinctively, offering more without a word. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of skin and sweat, with the unspoken acknowledgement that we were past the point of return. Her hands traveled upward, unbuttoning the edge of my shirt with slow precision. I felt the cool air against my chest for only a second before her mouth replaced it, warm and insistent. The contrast made me shiver, my body arching toward her touch as though pulled by instinct. Her tongue traced patterns across my skin, each stroke deliberate, each pause unbearable. I clutched at the edges of the table, grounding myself as waves of sensation coursed through me. The clinical space had transformed into something sacred and dangerous, a place where my body no longer belonged solely to me. She slid lower, her mouth mapping a path from my chest down across my stomach, leaving trails of heat that ignited everything they touched. My legs trembled as her hands pressed them apart, firm and commanding, leaving no room for hesitation. When her lips brushed against the inside of my thigh, I felt myself unravel, my breath escaping in broken gasps. The anticipation was almost unbearable, a thin line stretched to its limit. When she finally closed the distance, the shock of pleasure ripped through me, sharp and overwhelming. I gripped the table tighter, my body arching as though every nerve had awakened at once. Her tongue moved with devastating patience, slow and purposeful, savoring each reaction she drew from me. I could hear the sound of my own breathing, ragged and desperate, filling the small room like confession. My hips lifted without thought, seeking more, finding her rhythm and falling into it helplessly. She held me steady, her hands pressing firmly into my thighs, keeping me tethered even as I drifted into chaos. The heat built inside me with relentless force, a rising tide that threatened to break me open. When it finally crested, I shattered in silence, my body convulsing under her mouth, my vision blurring with the force of release. I collapsed back against the table, trembling, my skin damp with sweat, my chest rising and falling in frantic waves. She did not move away immediately, instead trailing soft kisses up my stomach, up my chest, until her lips found mine. The taste of myself lingered on her tongue, startling and intoxicating, binding me further into the truth of what we had done. I kissed her back with a hunger I didn't know I possessed, clutching her close, needing the weight of her body against mine. Every boundary that had once held us apart had dissolved, leaving nothing but this raw, unfiltered intimacy. When she finally pulled back, her forehead rested against mine, our breaths tangled together in the thick air. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed not only by what I had felt, but by the knowledge of what it meant. This was no accident, no fleeting mistake. It was a crossing, a transformation, a decision made without words, but sealed in the deepest parts of my body. I lay there beneath her, undone and remade, and realized I no longer cared about healing my knee. What I wanted now was her. In every way she would let me have her, no matter the cost. The days that followed blurred together, though I carried every moment of that night inside me like a secret flame. My body still hummed with the memory of her touch, the way she had held me steady, as though she alone controlled the rhythm of my release. I told myself to return to normal, to walk into her office as though nothing had changed, but the truth lived in my skin, in every place her lips had claimed. Even when I dressed in the morning, I could still feel her mouth tracing my collarbone, her fingers pressing into my hips. Ordinary routines became charged with a hunger that refused to fade. When I returned for the next session, I knew I was lying to myself by calling it therapy. My knee had healed well enough, the ache nearly gone, but I walked into that room not for treatment, but for her. The sight of her waiting, calm and steady, ignited something deep in my chest, a pull stronger than any sense of caution. I sat on the table, my body tense with anticipation, pretending to adjust my leg when in truth I was waiting for her hands to find me again. The silence between us carried the weight of knowledge, as though we both understood exactly what we were here for. Her touch began in the same practiced manner, but I felt the difference immediately. There was no rush, no urgency, only deliberate patience, as if she wanted me to feel every second of her presence. She guided my leg, tested the joint, but her hand lingered too long on my thigh, tracing subtle circles that had nothing to do with medicine. The heat spread quickly, crawling up my stomach, filling my chest until I thought I might suffocate. I closed my eyes, letting myself drift, and when her fingers pressed higher, I parted my legs instinctively, silently begging her not to stop. Her mouth found me before I could prepare, lowering with a certainty that stole my breath. I gripped the table, my knuckles whitening as her tongue moved slowly, savoring every gasp that escaped my throat. She didn't rush me to the edge this time. She pulled me toward it, then held me there, her hands firm against my thighs, keeping me open and helpless. My hips arched upward, chasing her rhythm, but she controlled the pace, making me tremble with frustration and need. The intensity built like a storm inside me, every nerve raw, every muscle straining for release. When it finally broke, it ripped through me with such force that I cried out, the sound echoing in the sterile room, turning the space into something far from clinical. When she rose, her lips glistening, she pressed her mouth to mine, and I tasted myself again, warm and sweet against her tongue. It should have shamed me, but it only deepened the hunger, binding me closer to her. I pulled her against me, desperate to feel the full weight of her body pressing into mine. My hands explored the lines of her back, sliding beneath her shirt, memorizing the warmth of her skin. She let me take her down onto the table, our bodies entwining in a way that blurred every distinction between healer and patient, giver and receiver. This time I touched her. My fingers found the edge of her waistband, slipping beneath, discovering the slick heat waiting for me. She gasped softly into my neck, her breath hot, her body arching as though she had been waiting for this moment as much as I had. I moved slowly, savoring the power of her trembling, the way her hips rolled helplessly against my hand. Her sounds filled the room, low and broken, weaving into my pulse until I could no longer separate her pleasure from my own. When she came undone, collapsing against me, I felt an intoxicating rush of control, as though I had finally claimed a part of her that no one else had touched. Afterward, we lay tangled together on the narrow table, our skin damp, our breath uneven. The room smelled of sweat, heat, and something far more primal than therapy. I ran my fingers through her hair, holding her close, terrified of the silence that might follow. But the silence was not cold. It was thick, sacred, filled with the unspoken truth of what we had done. I wanted to freeze time in that moment, to remain wrapped around her forever, to never return to the world outside where this could not exist. When I finally dressed, my body still trembling with echoes of her touch, I felt the shift more clearly than ever. I was no longer her patient, and she was no longer my therapist. We had become something dangerous, something forbidden, something that could not survive in daylight but thrived in shadows. And yet, I craved it more fiercely than anything I had ever allowed myself to want. I walked out of the room carrying her scent on my skin, her taste on my lips, and the heavy certainty that there was no turning back. I woke the next morning with her scent still clinging to my skin, heavy and undeniable. My sheets were tangled around my body, and the ache in my muscles was not from any injury, but from the intensity of what we had done. I lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering how a sterile treatment room had become the place where my world shifted. Nothing about my life outside had changed, yet everything inside me felt altered beyond recognition. I knew I could no longer tell myself this was just therapy. When I arrived for what should have been another session, the room felt different, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of our bodies pressed against them. I sat on the edge of the table, pretending patience, while my stomach twisted in restless hunger. She moved with the same calm as always, but I could sense it too, the edge in the air, the silent understanding that nothing about this was professional anymore. The moment her hand brushed my arm, the flood of heat returned, sharp and consuming. I had lost the ability to separate healing from desire, treatment from surrender. She guided me back onto the table, but it was no longer about stretching or recovery. Her hands spread across my chest, her mouth followed, and I gave myself to the rhythm of her control without hesitation. Each kiss was deeper, hungrier, as though she wanted to claim every part of me at once. I felt myself dissolve under her weight, my body trembling with need. When her fingers slipped lower, finding the place that throbbed for her, I broke apart again, my voice escaping in a sound I had never heard from myself before. This time, I wanted more than release. I wanted her, fully, without distance or restraint. I pulled her down onto me, my hands exploring the length of her body, feeling her warmth press into mine. I slid my fingers beneath her waistband, desperate to taste the same vulnerability I had given her. She arched against me, her breath hot against my ear, her body trembling as I touched her. The power of her unraveling filled me with a strange satisfaction, a sense of balance, as if we had finally become equal in our undoing. Afterward, we lay side by side, the table narrow, our limbs tangled awkwardly, but with no desire to move. The air smelled of sweat and something rawer, something animal. I stroked her skin slowly, afraid of the silence, yet unable to break it with words that would sound too small for what had happened. My heart pounded in a mix of awe and confusion, knowing that the line between patient and therapist had vanished entirely. We were no longer pretending, and there was no way back. When I finally gathered my things and left, the hall outside felt too bright, too ordinary. I walked past the reception desk with shaky legs, still tasting her on my lips. My reflection in the glass door startled me. I looked the same, yet nothing about me was the same. The world went on with its rhythm, but I carried within me a secret that made every step heavier. It was both intoxicating and suffocating. The final shock came days later, when I returned unannounced, desperate to see her again. I opened the door quietly, only to find her with someone else, stretched out on the same table where I had surrendered myself. Her hands moved with the same practiced intensity, her mouth lowering with the same hunger I thought had been mine alone. I froze, breath caught in my throat, unable to step forward or to turn away. My body filled with heat, a mixture of shame, fury, and something darker that I could not name. She looked up briefly, her eyes meeting mine with calm acknowledgement, as though this was inevitable. There was no apology, no guilt, only a steady gaze that told me everything. I was not special, not chosen. I was one of many, another body healed in ways that went far beyond treatment. The realization should have destroyed me, but instead it left me trembling with a twisted ache of desire. I felt myself wanting her still, even as disgust curled in my chest. I closed the door softly, leaving her to her work, though my heart hammered with contradictions. The image of her mouth on another body seared itself into me, merging with the memory of her mouth on mine. I hated it and craved it in the same breath. I walked out into the daylight carrying that truth, heavy and unshakable. She had taken me beyond healing, beyond intimacy, into a place I could never escape. And the most unsettling part was not that she had given herself to others the same way she had given herself to me. It was that I wanted to go back, to lie down again on that table, to surrender to her touch, even knowing the truth. The boundary had been shattered, the trust twisted, but the hunger remained. I realized then that therapy had cured my knee, but broken something far deeper, and I wasn't sure I wanted it fixed.